Hello, class. The following is a recording of the first chapter of The Jungle by American muckraker Upton Sinclair. It was written in 1906, and it will be the companion reading to our unit on the Progressive Era. The author's intent was to show the plight of the American immigrant, but in the end it did more to exhibit the corrupt practices of the American meat industry. And so, without further ado, the first chapter of The Jungle. It was 4 o'clock when the ceremony was over and the carriages began to arrive. There had been a crowd following all the way, owing to the exuberance of Maria Bernenskis. The occasion rested heavily upon Maria's broad shoulders. It was her task to see that all things went in due form, and after the best home traditions, and flying wildly hither and thither, bowling everyone out of the way, and scolding and exhorting all day with her tremendous voice, Maria was eager to see that others conformed to the proprieties, to consider them herself. She had left the church last of all, and desiring to arrive first at the hall, had issued orders to the coachman to drive faster. When that personage had developed a will of his own in the matter, Maria had flung up the window of the carriage, and leaning out proceeded to tell him her opinion of him, first in Lithuanian, which he did not understand, and then in Polish, which he did. Having the advantage of her in altitude, the driver had stood his ground, and even ventured to attempt to speak, and the result had been a furious altercation, which, continuing all the way down Ashland Avenue, had added a new swarm of urchins to the cortege at each side of the street for half a mile. This was unfortunate, for already there was a throng before the door. The music had started up, and half a block away you could hear the dull boom, boom of a cello with the squeaking of two fiddles, which vied with each other in intricate and altitudinous gymnastics. Seeing the throng, Maria abandoned precipitously the debate concerning the ancestors of her coachman, and springing from the moving carriage, plunged and proceeded to clear a way into the hall. Once within, she turned and began to push the other way, roaring meantime, "Eek, eek, Izarek Duras," in tones which made the orchestral uproar sound like fairy music. Zigracia Zunas, Passalinks Mianmas, Darzas, Vinas, Synapses, Wines and Liquors, Union Headquarters. That was the way the signs ran. The reader, who perhaps has never held much converse in the language of far-off Lithuania, will be glad of the explanation that the place was the rear room of a saloon that in that part of Chicago known as back of the yards. This information is definite and suited to the matter of fact, but how pitifully inadequate it would have seemed to one who understood that it was also the supreme hour of ecstasy in the life of one of God's gentlest creatures, the scene of the wedding feast and the joy transfiguration of little Ona Lucozade. She stood in the doorway, shepherded by Cousin Maria, breathless from pushing through the crowd, and in her happiness painful to look upon. There was a light of wonder in her eyes, and her lids trembled, and her otherwise wan little face was flushed. She wore a muslin dress, conspicuously white, and a stiff little veil coming to her shoulders. There were 5 pink paper roses twisted in the veil, and 11 bright green rose leaves. There were new white cotton gloves upon her hands, and as she stood staring about her, she twisted them together feverishly. It was almost too much for her. You could see the pain of too great emotion in her eyes, and all the tremor of her form. She was young, not quite 16, and small for her age, a mere child, and she had been married, and married to Jorgis, of all men, Jorgis Rudkis, he with the white flower in the buttonhole of his new black suit, he with the mighty shoulders and the giant hands. Ona was blue-eyed and fair, while Jorgis had great black eyes with beetling brows and thick black hair that curled in waves about his ears. In short, they were one of those incongruous and impossible married couples with which Mother Nature so often wills to confound all prophets before and after. Jorgis could take up a 250-pound quarter of beef and carry it into a car without a stagger or even a thought, and now he stood in a far corner, frightened as a hunted animal, and obliged to moisten his lips with his tongue each time before he could answer the congratulations of his friends. Gradually there was effected a separation between the spectators and the guests, a separation at least sufficiently complete for working purposes. There was no time during the festivities which ensued when there were not groups of onlookers in the doorways and the corners, and if any one of these onlookers came sufficiently close or looked sufficiently hungry, a chair was offered him, and he was invited to the feast. It was one of the laws of the Vasilia that no one goes hungry, and while a rule made in the forests of Lithuania is hard to apply in the stockyards district of Chicago with its 250,000 inhabitants, still they did their best, and the children who ran in from the street, and even the dogs, went out happier. A charming informality was one of the characteristics of this celebration. The men wore their hats, or, if they wished, they took them off, and their coats with them. They ate when and where they pleased, and moved as often as they wished. So with laughter and shouts and endless badinage and merriment, the guests take their places. The young men, who for the most part have been huddled near the door, summon their resolution and advance, and the shrinking Yorgis is poked and scolded by the old folks until he consents to seat himself at the right hand of the bride. The two bridesmaids, whose insignia of office are paper wreaths, come next, and after them the rest of the guests, old and young, boys and girls. The spirit of the occasion takes hold of the stately bartender, who condescends to a plate of stewed duck, even the fat policeman, whose duty it will be, later in the evening, to break up the fights, draws up a chair at the foot of the table, and the children shout and the babies yell, and everyone laughs and sings and chatters, while above all the deafening clamor, Cousin Maria shouts orders to the musicians. The musicians, how shall one begin to describe them? All this time they have been there, playing in a mad frenzy. All of this scene must be read, or said, or sung to music. It is the music which makes it what it is. It is the music which changes the place from the rear room of a saloon in the back of the yards to a fairy place, a wonderland, a little corner of the high mansions of the sky. The little person who leads this trio is an inspired man. His fiddle is out of tune, and there is no rosin on his bow, but still he is an inspired man. The hands of muses have been laid upon him. He plays like one possessed by a demon, by a whole horde of demons. You can feel them in the air around him, capering frenetically with their invisible feet. They set the pace, and the hair of the leader of the orchestra rises on end, and his eyeballs start from their sockets as he toils to keep up with them. Timosius Kuzleka is his name, and he has taught himself to play the violin by practicing all night after working all day on the killing beds. He is in his shirt sleeves, with a vest figured with faded gold horseshoes, and a pink-striped shirt suggestive of peppermint candy. A pair of military trousers, light blue with a yellow stripe, serve to give that suggestion of authority proper to the leader of a band. He is only about 5 feet high, but even so, those trousers are about 8 inches short of the ground. You wonder where he can have gotten them, or rather, you would wonder if the excitement of being in his presence left you time to think of such things. For he is an inspired man. Every inch of him is inspired. You might also say inspired separately. He stamps with his feet. He tosses his head. He sways and swings to and fro. He has a wizened-up little face, irresistibly comical, and when he executes a turn or a flourish, his brows knit, and his lips work, and his eyelids wink. The very ends of his necktie bristle out, and every now and then he turns upon his companions, nodding, signaling, beckoning frantically, with every inch of him appealing, imploring in behalf of the muses and their call.